With these YouTube episodes, I won't be going into creative systems theory and its multiple patterning concepts, at least in any detail. For that, you can turn to my books, in particular the book Creative Systems Theory, or some of the longer articles on the Cultural Maturity blog. But a few particular insights from the theory help highlight the power of the kind of understanding that becomes possible with cultural maturity's cognitive reordering. For many people watching these episodes, these further reflections won't be of great interest, but others may find them of particular value. I find a specific concept within creative systems theory, what it calls the myth of the individual, particularly provocative. The concept takes us well beyond how we tend to think in our time, but once understood, it is fundamentally important and radical. Its implications help us capture what identity of the more complete sort needed today in all parts of our lives is asking of us. The myth of the individual alerts us to an essential recognition. The defining achievement of the modern age project is commonly thought of as a final realization of the individual as choice maker. But what we have seen to this point has in fact remained fundamentally short of this result. Individuality in any complete sense requires cultural maturity's further, more integrative changes. The myth of the individual provides some of the best evidence that a further chapter in culture's story is needed and possible. To illustrate both what before has been lacking and how more might be possible, I often highlight a couple of modern age assumptions that I expand on in other episodes. The first is the belief that modern democratic governance represents government by the people, this in the sense of determination by individuals. The other is the belief with Romeo and Juliet style romantic love that we have similarly realized love as individual choice. It's important to affirm that both modern democratic government and romantic love have represented major steps forward. But it's just as important to recognize that in each case the result was not what we have thought it to be. In each case, identity was mythologized, based on one half of a polar dynamic. Needed insights regarding governance start with the recognition that historically we've always elevated our leaders and made them more than just human. We've projected onto them much of our own authority. This kind of mythologizing is most obvious with times well past when kings and god-kings provided unquestioned, even divine authority. But while today we tend to assume that we have left such dynamics behind us, in fact, authority relationships with modern democratic governance have for the most part remained, if a two halves makes a whole, mythologized sort. Think Kennedy in Camelot or Ronald Reagan as the kind father figure. Modern romantic love, in that it took us beyond having determinations made by the family or a matchmaker, was more about choice than love had been historically. But in a similar way, it remained based on idealization and projection. I, as a man, projected an idealized aspect of the archetypally feminine onto the woman, and the woman did the complement with an idealized archetypally masculine part of herself. Brave knight meets fair maiden. Again, we see identity based on a two halves makes a whole assumption. In neither case have we witnessed individual identity in the whole person, all the crayons in the box sense that comes with cultural maturity's cognitive changes. The focus with each of these examples is on individual identity of a personal sort, but we can make a related observation with regard to more collective identity. When collective identity depends on having enemies, as I described in an episode on War and Peace, This on dividing our worlds into chosen people and others. In an analogous way, it stops short of identity in any fully systemic sense. It remains a mythologized two halves makes a whole kind of identity. And this is the case equally when the enemy in question is another nation or a group with a contrasting political or social ideology. I think of the myth of the individual as having three parts. Each part, in different ways, adds to our systemic picture of understanding and further ties it to a needed next chapter in our human story. First is the assumption that in modern times we have in fact been individuals. We've thought of a new freedom for the individual with both leadership and love as what most defined what was different from what we had known before. With the beginnings of history's modern age, a world in which more authoritarian forms of leadership and where love's determinations were made by that family or matchmaker, gave way to a reality in which we experienced, indeed celebrated choice as laying increasingly in our hands. But with both leadership and love, this realization of the individual was illusionary, or at least partial and preliminary. In each case, what we saw was two halves make a whole relationship. Being half of a systemic whole is not yet about being an individual, certainly not in any complete sense. The second part of the modern myth of the individual concerns the assumption that individuality, as we have thought of it, represents an ideal and endpoint. In fact, it represents neither an ideal nor an endpoint, being that such individuality, the kind we saw with heroic leadership and romantic love, leaves us short of the kind of relating we need for the future. It can't be an ideal, and being that further realities are very much possible, it can't be an endpoint. Being an individual takes on a fundamentally different meaning with cultural maturity's cognitive changes. Individual identity becomes about consciously holding the whole of our human complexity. The third part of the modern myth of the individual concerns a more specific way the way we have thought about individual and identity ultimately falls short. It would be reasonable to assume that individuality, when fully realized, would be about finally becoming wholly distinct. But this assumption only further extends the modern age definition. Culturally mature identity reflects a more fully systemic picture. A capacity for greater distinction is indeed very much part of what culturally mature identity gives us. Culturally mature leadership and love each involve the ability to stand more fully separate. But this capacity for greater distinction is only half of what we find. More consciously engaging the whole of our multifaceted complexity also alters identity in the sense that it deepens our capacity for connectedness. Whole person, whole system leadership offers the possibility of deeper and more authentic engagement between the leaders and those the leader represents. And whole person love, in a similar way, offers the possibility of more complete and enduring bonds. The deeper connection that comes with cultural maturity cognitive changes is in part a product of the fact that we bring ourselves more wholly to the task of relating and are thus capable of engaging in fuller ways. But there is a further factor that follows from all that human complexity includes. Along with increasing our capacity for real difference, integrative meta-perspective offers that we might draw more consciously on parts of ourselves that appreciate that to live is to be connected to others we care about, in community, with nature, and with existence more generally. I need to emphasize a critical recognition here. This deeper capacity for connectedness cannot happen by itself. We must at once and first fully realize our fundamental distinctness. But this additional contribution is essential to fully realize whole person identity and relationship. The implications of leaving behind the myth of the individual are not just conceptual. In the end, they cannot be practical and essential for moving forward. For example, it's worth taking a moment to reflect further on the notion that modern democratic government represents government by the people. This, in the sense of government as an expression of individual choice, is a myth. It implies a radical conclusion that a possible further chapter in the story of government lies ahead. If we have not yet witnessed government by the people, at least not in the mature systemic sense that the concept of cultural maturity is proposed as now becoming necessary and possible, we reasonably ask what this suggests for the future. Several kinds of cultural maturity-related changes could combine to contribute to a next chapter in government. I think specifically of stepping beyond seeing nation-states and their institution as mythic parents, setting aside ideological polarization and partisan pettiness, and leaving behind mythologized concepts of leadership. We can now add one more that in an important way brings all the others together. Culturally mature governance becomes more authentically government by the people. Government as an expression of human identity in its fully mature manifestation. We find another consequence of getting beyond the myth of the individual and how doing so reconciles a debate from my field of psychology and psychiatry. The debate had its origins mid-century, but it remains alive today. Here I refer to the battle over the nature of the self. Besides helping to further fill out how cultural maturity's changes expand our understanding of identity, the topic in another way highlights how fundamentally a culturally mature picture of identity challenges assumptions and in all persuasions. In addition, it supports the use of creative language. In this debate, we find behaviorists along sometimes with the more extreme of cognitive theorists on one side, and we find humanists and those of more analytical bent on the other. Behaviorists, at least of the more extreme right-hand sort, tend to dismiss the whole notion of a self. They make it all behavior. Those who put greater emphasis on inner reflection, particularly of the more extreme inclination, tend to wax poetically about the authentic, true, or original self, which therapeutic process is supposed to be about recovering. It turns out that neither view holds up well to scrutiny. Making us only behavior leaves out not just inner experience, but any appreciation of meaning and coherence. And making identity an opposite to conditioning, belief, and the stuff of the material world, in the end dismisses who we are as manifesting and manifest beings. Put in the systemic metaphor I have drawn on here, seen from a culturally mature perspective, identity becomes about who we are in consciously holding the whole box of crayons. This more systemic picture of identity requires integrative meta-perspective to fully appreciate, but arguably a meaningful sense of identity going forward depends on it. With culturally mature changes, the concept of self makes useful sense, but only as something that includes all of our systemic complexity. This conclusion becomes obvious with it all deep clinical work. The approaches applied by advocates of either opposing school of thought can be useful, but they are also each vulnerable to major traps from which they have no means of escape. In this picture, because the notion of a self very much makes sense, indeed a specifically living, meaning sort of self, behaviorism is fundamentally challenged. But more reflective approaches are challenged just as fundamentally. Here, self becomes explicitly different from some essence. It includes all of our often contradictory ways of seeing the world, more left hand and more right hand, equally or more precisely in the particular balance of our temperament that our particular temperament reflects. And it is certainly different from some original essence. Self, in any sense pertinent to meaning, exists in time. It is not about original purity and space. It lies with every part of our life experience. Viewed from a culturally mature systemic perspective, self includes all our cognitive complexity, and being authentic means simply using that complexity in the most powerful and, with cultural maturity, consciously congruent ways. The more whole person picture of identity that results provides not just more accurate self understanding, but also a deeper sense of meaning. It will be key to addressing what I've described as today's crisis of purpose. It also suggests that a post ideological future might be at least a possibility. I've described how creative systems theory defines ideology as what we get when we take one crayon in the systemic box and make it the whole of truth. When we embrace a more whole person understanding of self, we step over the threshold into a world in which ideology, rather than defining us, is perceived as failing, as getting in the way of what it means to fully be a person. When we add creative systems patterning notions, as here, even at this basic level, what I describe is not so simple, but hopefully at least a bit I've been able to articulate how the result fits with my proposal that the task ahead is, in the end, common sense. Again, your thoughts and questions are appreciated.